Hey everybody, it's a Call 6 investigator, Kara Kenney. We are here talking about renters' rights, one of your favorite topics. In fact, it is probably the #1 call to the Call 6 tip line. People are always talking about mold and bed bugs and no heat and all kinds of issues with landlords. And we actually have a special guest. This is Chase Holler. He is with the Neighborhood Christian Legal Clinic, correct? Got their name right?
Thank you.
He is here to answer your questions. So let's hear them. We want to know what your questions are. We want to know what your concerns are. Talk to me about what your concerns are in terms of your landlord, your apartment complex. We're here to tell you what your rights are. So maybe we could just kick the conversation off. Any misconceptions, like what's the biggest misconception that people have about their apartment complex or anything?
I think probably the biggest misconception is this idea of withholding rent. Many tenants, when they're faced with a situation where the landlord's not fixing anything, they think, you know what, I'm not going to pay next month. And that's not okay. That will end up, in most cases, getting you an eviction. So that there are proper ways to deal with those types of situations, and there are ways that are going to get you into more trouble.
Okay, so if you are just joining us, we're talking about renters' rights. What are your rights as a renter? So what Chase Holler with the Neighborhood Christian Legal Clinic just told us is that withholding a rent, big no-no. You can actually lose some of your renters' rights by doing that. And if you go to court, that could be a big sticking point for the judge, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So the only way under Indiana law that you can actually withhold rent, you have to follow a very strict process, and that's you have to give notice to your landlord. If it's an item that needs to be fixed, you have to give them a reasonable amount of time to fix that issue. For instance, let's say your furnace goes out. You got to give them a reasonable amount of time to fix the furnace. If they don't fix it within a reasonable amount of time, you can pay somebody to do that service to bring the furnace unit back into compliance, and then you can subtract that fee that you paid the HVAC technician from your next month's rent. That's the only time that you can withhold rent under Indiana law.
Okay, so we're still waiting to hear your comments and your questions about your landlord, about your apartment complex. What are some do's? What are some don'ts? Aside from not paying rent, what are some of the things that landlords are doing wrong that you see that kind of get you upset?
The things that get me upset are generally when landlords are just doing a straight lease of a property and they put something in there that says you accept the property as is, and we're not going to do any repairs, essentially. That's completely contrary to Indiana law. Indiana law states that they have to deliver the property to you in a safe, clean, and habitable condition. They have to maintain the plumbing, electrical systems, a reasonable supply of hot and cold water, all the normal things you would expect, the sort of nuts and bolts of how a rental property works. Then the more typical, just tiny maintenance type of things, the tenant is typically responsible for. So.
What about smoke detectors?
Well, that'd be a code compliance issue. So typically a property is not going to be code compliant if they're not having the smoke detectors in the correct places that are operable. So the local health and housing code is going to determine who's responsible for that. I would guess in most jurisdictions it would be the landlord that's responsible for making sure that those are operable. Now, is it reasonable for them to put something in the lease that says, please test these every few months or something like that? It probably is. But they need to be operable at all times.
Okay, and so people are just now starting to join us. Brian Johnson, do you have any questions or concerns about your apartment complex? He says he doesn't want to broadcast it over the internet. Obviously, some people don't want to talk in public about their landlord concerns, but earlier today we had a Facebook post about the top ways that landlords can cheat you out of money, and you just brought up a couple of them. But we heard time and time again from people who want to talk about their issues, and one of the things that stuck out to me is we heard from a few landlords who said, it's not just all of us being bad, that we have a lot of bad renters out there. So what are some ways that you can be a good renter? Obviously pay on time, we all know that, but I mean, what else can you do?
Well, first of all, I agree with that. Whenever we look at leasing property, we have to remember that it's a two-way street. Okay, you're in a contract as a tenant. Your landlord's going to have some reasonable expectations on you as well. Making sure you're keeping the property clean and you're doing normal cleaning and maintenance. You're not bothering your neighbors, those sorts of things. And the second part of your question, sorry, was...
I was asking for how do you be a good renter?
Oh,
I
sure.
said brought
Okay.
up obviously
Yeah.
paying on time, using the property in a reasonable manner. Don't
Right.
invite 12 of your friends to live with you. But
Right,
I mean,
it's
what
mostly
else?
common
Yeah.
sense. Yeah,
Right.
it's mostly common sense. Well, first of all, knowing, what your contract says. You have an opportunity when you sign that contract to, talk with your landlord about what their expectations, of you are. And, if you have concerns, you can try and get that out of the way whenever you do the initial contract. But otherwise, it's the normal, being a good neighbor, not causing excessive noise, making sure that you're kind and respectful, when you're making requests for repairs and things like that. There can be a lot of interpersonal conflict in the landlord-tenant relationship when you disagree about something. It's okay to have disagreements, but when those disagreements spiral out of control, that's when you get into a situation where either a landlord starts retaliating by doing something or the tenant starts retaliating. I hope this discussion doesn't make anyone feel like, oh, we're out there to vilify landlords or housing providers.
No,
There are
not at all.
a ton of amazing organizations out there that provide housing. I serve on the auxiliary board of Partners in Housing, which is a local organization, does a lot of great work in the community. They rent properties, they're a housing provider, but they do it the right way. Okay, so it's more so just people need to be aware. Tenants need to be aware what their rights are under Indiana law and what paths they can take to deal with different situations.
Right.
So.
And if you're just joining us, we are talking about renters' rights. What are your rights as a renter? It is the #1 call to the Call 6 tip line. People are always asking about mold, bed bugs, no heat, no air conditioning, all kinds of landlord issues. And so we want to hear from you and what your concerns are. We have an expert right here who can answer those questions for you. And says, are we going to see user comments from earlier posts? Not sure what you mean by that, Stephen James. Do you know what he means by that?
We can pull up that Facebook
Oh,
post
from
that
the
you were
article.
Oh,
talking
the
about.
Facebook
Yeah.
post.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
good
the Facebook post from earlier that I think Steven's talking about is we posted a story about the 7 ways that landlords can cheat tenants, and it was a very popular story. People started talking about their landlords, their apartment complexes. We heard from landlords, we heard from tenants. A lot of questions about the landlord's making me pay for replacing the entire carpet when there was only a small stain, and just kind of those types of concerns and stuff. How do you protect yourself if a landlord or an apartment complex is trying to get you to pay for repairs that you really think is excessive?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a really common one that comes up. Probably the #1 thing is making sure you're doing a move-in inspection and move-out inspection.
And take pictures, right?
Taking
Document
your pictures,
it.
document. It's best to have some sort of piece of paper that you're both making note of, a stain or a hole in the wall or little things that the landlord may have just not noticed when they, before they prepared the property for you. That way, when you move out, the landlord can't suddenly say, oh, well, there's all this damage that you're now on the hook for. And we have to remember, too, there's going to be disagreements over what's reasonable wear and tear. Having a little bit of carpet wear from one room to another, and you've lived there for a few years, that's pretty much reasonable wear and tear. But if you've got stains in the carpeting,
Holes in the wall,
stuff like that very clearly you caused, you're going to have to financially pay for that.
Yeah,
So.
and when I say holes in the wall, I'm talking about big holes, but I mean, what
Sure.
about just nail holes? Obviously, people hang pictures.
Right, and actually some landlords will say you can't hang anything on the walls, okay,
So
in the
read your
contract.
lease.
Read your lease. It may say you need to, do some kind of filler on there and sand it. You may need to paint over it, whatever you got to do.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So make sure that you're reading your lease, because that is key. And if you have questions about your lease before you're signing it, have an attorney read it. Usually attorneys will do so for even just a nominal fee, or you can get someone like Chase to read it for what you do.
Yeah,
you guys do it
actually-
for free at the clinic?
Yeah, so actually what I would say is one of the most important things you can do is have your lease reviewed by an attorney before you ever sign it, especially if you have questions about it. There are all flavors of contracts out there: rent to buy, regular rent, rent with an option to purchase, and they can be very confusing.
We've got a couple of good questions coming in. It says, I'm going through, Lamar says, I'm going through some things with our landlord. How do you get out of your lease if they're not keeping up the property when we make maintenance requests that are major? I know there's something called a constructive eviction.
Yeah.
So how do you get out of your lease if you feel like they're not making those repairs?
So constructive eviction is a common law term, and basically the idea is whatever the problem is, it's rendered the property uninhabitable. And so by law, you can leave and you don't owe anything else under the contract. Okay.
But it has to be uninhabitable.
It has to be uninhabitable.
Yeah,
the big mistake that people make is they say, this property is not livable. But then they go into court and the judge is like, well, when did you leave? And they're like, oh, I'm still living there. And it's like, well, if it's not livable, why are you living there? So you just have to make sure if the property is rendered unlivable, let's say there's a huge leak in the ceiling and it caves in and you're subject to the elements, mold, everything else. You've notified the landlord. They don't come to fix it within a reasonable time. You need to just pack your stuff and go, do what you got to do for your family, but make sure you document all that as well.
Okay. We're getting a question from Stephanie McLean. She says, we have one carpet stain, no holes in the wall, and they put in super cheap carpet, and now all of a sudden it is our fault. I took pictures. I feel like it's a losing battle. Okay, so it sounds like she's on the hook for some damage to her apartment that she feels is excessive. What's the best move there? Is it to go to small claims court and file a complaint, or what's the avenue if you feel like you're getting wrongfully charged?
Yeah, so if you have a security deposit, that's sort of the idea with the security deposit is that when you move out, you have some buffer, that the landlord's not going to say, oh, you owe me all this money. Okay. Now with a carpet stain, if it's really legitimately stained, you can try and get it professionally cleaned. You can go through those kind of steps. If that doesn't work, you probably will be on the hook. But there are more questions than that. When was the carpet put in? How old is it? What's the the average life of that carpet that they put in? They have 10-year, 7-year, all these different types of carpet. And that matters when someone assesses damage as well. What they're going to have to pay someone, what it's going to cost. Whether they were going to go ahead and replace that carpet anyway.
Yeah. And Lamar wants to know, follow-up question to what you said, who determines if it's uninhabitable? Is that the judge?
Yeah, so in a small claims case, let's say you move out, you say, okay, the ceiling caved in, I can't live here anymore, I got to move my family. You up and leave. Landlord disagrees with you and says, actually, I came a few days after that. They file a suit against you for damages. It's going to be up to the judge to determine if the property was livable or not.
Okay, so hopefully Lamar got that. And Brian Johnson wants to know, can a landlord kick you out in 5 days? I'm guessing that probably depends on what's in your lease.
Yeah, and I think that question may be getting to this idea of self-help eviction. So it's not unusual for someone to have a disagreement with their landlord, or they don't pay, and the landlord, sticks a notice on the door. You got to get out in 5 days or 10 days, whatever it is. The problem with that is you can't evict someone without a court process. You have to go through court. They can't shut off your utilities, turn off your water, your electricity to try and get you out of the property. They can't harass you. They have to go through court and get a court order, period.
Okay, that's really good information. Hopefully Brian heard that. And Sandra wants to know, is it a fire hazard to have your windows painted shut by your landlord?
That's typically a problem, yeah. Local health and housing code is going to determine if that's an issue that they would have to fix. I've seen that before in health department reports, so I would say if it's really become, a contention between you and your landlord, you may have to go to the health department. And that's something we haven't talked about yet. They're a very useful tool, especially here in Marion County. They're excellent to work with. If you have a utility shut-off type situation like we were just talking about, where the landlords shut off your utilities for whatever reason and you're still living there, they'll do emergency inspections. But usually within a couple days, they'll come in and do an inspection. In a situation like that, they'd say, this violates, this code section, local health and housing code, and they give them an amount of time to fix that issue.
Right.
Or they face fines. So it can be much more powerful than a tenant just calling and saying, you need to, fix this.
Totally. And just so you guys know, we are working on a special report that's going to air tonight at 11 called Renters' Rights. And in it, we talk to the health department of what they can and cannot cite for, and just sort of get some more insight on what they do. And we learned that in 2015, it was something like 4,000 housing orders were issued to rental properties and other properties. So, I mean, it's really a huge issue. And for each order that's issued, there could be multiple violations in that order. And so it's interesting stuff. And Kayla Casey wants to know, she says, our landlord shut our gas off last night without giving us notice. We had a written agreement about utilities and she failed on her end. What can we do? Any ideas?
Well, like I just said, the health department, they will come out and do an inspection. If you tell them it's a utility shut off, they will try and get someone there as quickly as possible, so you pretty much get bumped to the top of the list for inspections.
Especially in the winter, that would bump it up to an emergency.
Oh, absolutely. And the health department will do what they can to reach out to that landlord and say, hey, you got to cut these back on. That's a violation of code. It's a tenant inhabited property. You got to keep the utilities on. And also any discussion that comes up in court, that's going to be a problem for the landlord, that they shut off the utilities. Judges do not like it because it's very clearly illegal, and it's one of the first things you learn probably when you're trying to figure out if you're going to rent a property or not. So I would say contact the health department. If that doesn't work, you could consider actually filing suit on your own. So that's the other thing I want to mention. The utility shutoffs, if you're not comfortable calling the health department or they don't help you for whatever reason, you can file suit in small claims court and ask for an emergency hearing. So
you are welcome, Kayla. And so one of the things that has also come up on our Facebook post today is about retaliation. So if you call the health department, can they retaliate against you in any way? Can they evict you for calling the health department? A lot of people are concerned about,
Right. My response to that would be no, because what would be the point of having all these health and housing codes if you could violate your lease by calling the health department? I've actually seen it in leases where it says if you call the health department because there's a problem, that'll be subject you to eviction.
Wow, really? Is that even legal to have that in your lease?
I would say no. There's nothing that specifically talks about that in the landlord-tenant statutes, but I would argue that provision's against public policy. So there are arguments you could make on the tenant side for sure that that's an illegal provision. I would always be comfortable advising people, even if your lease says that you should always feel comfortable calling the health department. At the end of the day, what else can you do?
And that's free to call the health department. To file a complaint in small claims court, around $100.
Yeah.
Okay, so obviously that's an expense for some people. But if you're being sued for thousands of dollars in back rent or damages or something like that, $100, you know. And obviously you're a clinic, the Neighborhood Christian Legal Clinic, Chase Holler, they are available to help answer these types of questions.
Sure.
That's what you guys do. So keep that in mind, that there is help available if you have questions beyond this Facebook Live.
Yeah, sure. And let me speak to that a little bit too. So if you want to seek our assistance, you can go to nclegalclinic.com. And there's an intake tab there. You come have an intake. You can speak with either one of our staff attorneys or one of our volunteer attorneys at one of our intake sites, and then your case will be forwarded for review for possible representation.
Okay, fantastic. It's good to know you guys are out there. And Sandra Virat wants to know, what about a house not being insulated at all and causing electric bills to be over $500, which is more than I pay for rent? Anything I can do or have done? And I think I have heard this concern from people before, that when the appliances, sometimes the appliances are there, but they don't run efficiently. And so people are getting hit with these big bills because their appliances aren't really being run efficiently.
Right.
Anything you can do beyond talking to your landlord?
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, it sounds like it might have a malfunction, or if it is a situation where the property's not really well insulated, that's tough, because you have an opportunity to inspect the house beforehand, ask for average utility bills, but at the end of the day, if that stuff's in there and it's functioning, and you're responsible for utilities, you're responsible for utilities unless there's a repair that needs to be done. So I would consider talking to the landlord about how you might deal with that, whether it's have someone come in to make sure it's functioning properly, or ask them if it's been a problem in the past and if there's any way they can make a rent adjustment for that. So that's a good question, though. It's a tough issue. It
is a tough issue, and I think it does, you hit on that point, that it is important to do your due diligence when you're looking at renting, and so that you don't hit these issues on the back end. One of the issues that some people run into is they're looking at apartment complexes and they show them maybe like a, you know what I mean, a model.
Oh, sure,
and they never
yeah.
actually see the unit that they're renting. Make sure that you're going to actually see the unit that you're renting and check it out. A lot of times people, if they're moving, we interviewed a woman who's going to be in our story tonight. She was in a rush because she had a preemie. She was in the hospital on bed rest, and so her husband was trying to find them a place to live. They needed a room for the baby, and they just kind of quickly did it. But so that's obviously some advice that to give.
Yeah, I mean, and talking with other neighbors, you know, if it's an apartment complex, looking on the internet, doing whatever you can, even if some of that stuff, people say, well, I don't want to invest a lot of time in it. There are a lot of things you can do very quickly. You can look up, like in Marion County, you can look up the Health and Housing Department. You can type that property address, see if there's been code violations. You can, you know, talk to the, you know, neighbors and other people around that have rented from that same company, and then you can see, hey, if they've got 1 out of 5 on Google reviews and there's 30 reviews, there's a pretty good chance you don't want to rent from them. So
Gotcha. Well, if you are just joining us, we are talking about renters' rights. We're taking your questions and concerns about landlord-tenant disputes. We have Chase Holler from the Neighborhood Christian Legal Clinic. It's quite the name. So, but he's here to answer your questions. We have a couple of thank yous from Lamar and Brian Johnson. You are quite welcome, you guys. And we want to hear more questions and concerns. We have probably about 5 minutes left, so now is the time to get them in. But anything else that we haven't talked about regarding landlord-tenant disputes and how to be a good landlord, how to be a good renter? We've hit a lot of stuff. Anything
sure.
I missed?
I'd tell people there are a couple of things. First, security deposits. I want to mention something about that. A lot of people, you know, they give the security deposit when they first move in and they move out, and they don't understand why they never heard anything about the security deposit. And the way the security deposit statute reads is, your landlord's not entitled to give you that money back or any of it back unless you give them a forwarding address after you move out. So
And they have to give you an accounting of what they did with that money.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. So you move out.
See, I know stuff.
You give them a forwarding address. Then within 45 days from that time, they have to itemize damages. So they have to say, here's your security deposit, here's what we deducted for these charges, and then here's the balance of your money, or here's all of it back if there weren't any problems.
Which is fantastic, because I'm sure a lot of people wonder whatever happened with that money, and it helps to protect you so that they're not just claiming, oh, well, you damaged your wall, I need your $500, whatever.
Right,
so
right,
that's interesting.
right.
Looks like we got a question from Erica Malone. It says, I have to give 2 months notice to get out of my lease early. Is there a way to get out of that if I want to move because of neighbor noise that I've complained about? Obviously, neighbor noise, that's a little bit probably different issue. That's more of a
pretty
police. Is that more of a police issue?
Yeah, I mean, it could become a nuisance, you know, issue if you've made multiple complaints and management's not doing anything about it. But then you get into, is that a breach of contract or not with your landlord? It is very common for leases to have those early termination provisions, and they often require you to pay a penalty.
Yeah.
And really, there's not a good way out of that, unfortunately, other than making sure that you know, when it comes to dealing with noise, I know it can be tough to say, well, I'm going to go talk to that, you know, person or whatever. That may be your easiest way to deal with it, is just say, look, hey, you know, I'm living next door. I've heard the music a lot late at night. Could you mind just kind of keeping it down when it's late? That may nip it in the bud right there, and avoid, you know, if you go through a complaint process, then somebody might take it personally. You know, so there are different ways to deal with that, but contractually, I don't think there's a whole lot to do about that.
Sorry, Erica. I wish we had better news. That's no fun. I've definitely been on the end. That's the thing about renters' rights. It's really so relatable, because who has not been in a situation where the person above you is really loud, or
Sure. Yeah.
they're having an issue with their landlord, or they're having an issue with the neighbor? I mean, it really is something that impacts just about everybody in our community. And I was telling you about how I saw a story in Houston where about half of the city rents. Any idea how much of Indianapolis, Marion County rents are we looking at?
I'm not sure.
40%? Or
Yeah,
60%?
I'm not sure what the total numbers are. I mean, you can see all these apartment buildings going up downtown. I mean, there's obviously huge rental demand, which tells you there are a lot of people in Indianapolis renting. And then, you know, a lot of folks lost their homes in the foreclosure crisis and are now, you know, forced in the rental market. So definitely a lot of people out there renting.
Got it. One more question. It
Okay.
says, Brian Johnson, if you and your landlord agreed to vacate on a specific date without any court process, is all ended, or can they or I continue a court process. So I think he's asking if there's been an agreement to vacate on a specific date, what happens after that?
Yeah, it really depends on what that agreement was. Was it oral and they just said, hey, we're going to, call this quits or whatever, or was it actually like a written release saying, hey, we both release all of our, claims, obligations to each other and signed and dated? Because I think you probably need a few more facts there to really know what somebody can do. Now, if you both sign a release and say, now we often advise clients to try and do an agreed move out where, there's been some kind of conflict, tenant may have some good points, landlord has some good points. It's just best not to have that relationship anymore. And they sign, a mutual release where they both just say, okay, we're not going to sue each other over this. Let's move on after this date.
Gotcha. Oh, okay. Hang on.
Oh, no.
Oh, wait. Well, here we go. Ruth. Rented the same home for 16 years. Haven't seen the landlord for at least 14 of those. Don't know where we have fixed anything wrong with them. Can she get us for normal wear and tear of the home?
Wow.
Okay, that's kind of bizarre. She hasn't seen your landlord in 14 years.
And to know what normal wear and tear is for 14 years too.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
A long time.
So obviously, I think you're saying that the wear and tear that's going to be up to a judge if it ends up in court.
Yeah.
So,
but I mean, obviously that factors into it. You've been living in a property for over a decade. There's going to be more, regular wear and tear than if
you're going to have a
you've
lot,
been there
Ruth.
a couple years. Yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, that Facebook is going to cut us off in just a few seconds. So I just want to thank everybody for tuning in, for your questions, for your comments. Lots of really good questions, and of course, thank you so much for joining us. Any parting words that you want people to know?
Just don't be afraid to ask questions before you move into a place, and know who you're dealing with. I mean, that's the biggest thing. Make sure that you know who you're renting that property from, you understand your lease and your obligations to one another, and talk to people who live in that community. Make sure you stay out of a bad situation. So
do your homework. We're always telling you guys, do your homework. And so after hopefully watching this Facebook Live, that you have a right to a property that is clean and safe and habitable. And so tonight at 11, we're going to tell you what other rights you have as a renter. So thanks everybody for tuning in. Thanks, Brian.